So what we're talking today is about why is it so hard to make this climate policy. So I'm going to introduce our speakers today. But I wanted to tell you a little bit of the journey of how we got here. So Doug Bender, who, as I say, is a member of Indivisible South Bay and PB Dems, he worked with me on today's climate meeting theme and the speakers. And it was Doug's link to the August 17th California State Assembly's Joint Legislative Committee on Climate Change Policies, which was chaired by Assembly member Muratsuchi, that introduced me to our speaker today, Dr. Danny Cullenward. It was back in I think 2000, maybe I did put the year down, so maybe they'll help me on this, but it was Governor Brown's approval of SB 32. I think it was in 2016, the California Global Warming Solutions Act, which established California's 2030 emission goal. And that was what the Joint Legislative Committee was talking about and how we get to that goal. And in his testimony before the committee, Dr. Cullenward made it very clear that we are not on track to meet our 2030 goals. California's plan to meet the 2030 goal was part of Assemblymember Muratsuchi's AB 1395, the California Climate Crisis Act, which got tabled in this past legislative session. And today's discussion will address why it is so hard to accelerate California's climate policy. Dr. Danny Cullenward is the policy director at Carbon Plan, a nonprofit research organization, and he's the vice chair of IEMAC, which stands for Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee, which advises the California Legislature and Air Resources Board on climate policy. Also, Cullenward is the author with David G. Victor of the book, Making Climate Policy Work. Joining Cullenward will be Assembly Al Muratsuchi, Assembly District 66. And this past Friday, Al Muratsuchi spoke alongside his colleagues, Congressman Ted Lieu, State Senator Ben Allen, and County Supervisor Janice Hahn at the Palos Verdes Chamber of Commerce Annual Legislative Forum. I hope some of you were able to attend it. This annual meeting has been great at demonstrating their close collaboration and working the issues that impact us locally in the state and nationally. During the Chamber of Commerce meeting, and significant to our theme today, I learned from Assemblymember Muratsuchi that he will be traveling to Glasgow for the UN Climate Change Conference, which convenes October 31 through November 12th. Perhaps he'll comment on how he got to be part of the US delegation. So we're going to start our discussion with Dr. Danny Cullenward, and then we'll follow it with Assemblymember Al Muratsuchi, and then we'll take questions.
All righty, well, thank you, Anne. Thank you, everybody, for the chance to speak with you. I'll share a few thoughts just to get us started, and I look forward to speaking with all of you and with Mr. Muratsuchi, whose leadership on climate issues I admire, and hope we'll be able to engage in a discussion around some of the key issues. So Anne asked me to talk about why it's so hard to make progress on climate policy. And I think the most honest answer is because if we take seriously the scale of the climate crisis, it's a really big thing to work on, and it requires fundamental transformative change in most aspects of our lives, of our economy, our infrastructure, most of the big things we do. And that is why it is necessarily inherently a political question. But it's one that isn't easy to solve, because unlike other areas of environmental policy where there's a relatively small number of players who have to figure out how to fix a problem, climate touches everything. And reducing emissions down to the level that we need on the timeframes we need to avoid the worst of climate change requires an all hands on deck approach. And that's very difficult to communicate to people. I come from a scientific and technical background. I spent a huge fraction of my life in grad school, wandering around with engineers and with scientists, learning about the Earth system, learning about the various technologies used in the energy sector that are both the source of a lot of our problems and, depending on how we deploy them, part of the solution. And I'm struck at just how difficult it is to convey the scale of the challenge both to people who don't come from a scientific background, but more importantly, to people in the political system who understandably have focused on a variety of other things in their lives, and climate is one of many issues they've been elected to address. The scale is enormous and it's overwhelming. And I don't want to say that to frighten or alarm people, but I think it's really important to anchor in that framing because it really does require massive efforts. Why has it been so hard? And why have people like me, for example, been critical of where the state of California has been recently? That's a long story. I will tell a short version of it, and I will flag a couple of the issues that I think are relevant to some of the deadlock we see right now in contemporary legislative negotiations. I do think, in all sincerity, that a huge part of why it's hard to make progress on climate is because we've told ourselves it's going to be easy, and we've allowed ourselves to sort of celebrate press announcements about the scale of our commitments and our successes, many of which are quite important. And we've done quite a bit of important groundwork in terms of building the capacity in our government and implementing innovative policies that others copy. But it's very easy to rest on those laurels or to think that we are simply leading because we've been saying we've been leading, we're leading for so long. And I think the complexity of this topic, combined with the ease with which people get attached to this leadership narrative, has made it really easy for us to lose about 5 years of progress. We're coming up on about 5 years of lost progress by my count. And I want to tell the story of how I think that happened, and then hopefully lead into some discussion around the Assembly members' very thoughtful bill around trying to create a long-term carbon neutrality standard and the framework for the target that matters for our species, for our state, for everything you might care about, and some of the touch points that make that such a challenging issue to work on. The reason I think, have been treading water at a very high level is actually very related to the debate you're reading about right now with respect to the budget reconciliation bill in the federal Congress. There's a lot of discussion right now about how to get 50 votes plus the vice president's tie-breaking vote on a package of things that address multiple critical social issues during a unique window in which the Democratic Party has potential control of the legislative and policymaking agenda. And it is not that climate is more or less important than things like the various forms of child assistance, employment, insurance issues, the critical social issues that are part of that package. Every constituency within the party thinks of their own particular view of what's important as the most important piece of the puzzle. And we see that kind of dynamic a lot in these climate policy conversations. We are also now seeing, with the somewhat both surprising and completely unexpected news, that Senator Manchin is opposing the landmark climate policy in the budget reconciliation measure, a payment system designed to reward and penalize utilities for either their above average deployment of clean energy or a laggard pace of development. This landmark piece of the bill, Senator Manchin has announced he won't follow. And there is once again renewed discussion about whether or not a price on carbon, a tax on carbon pollution, could replace that in the budget reconciliation process. And I've been having one of these moments that people in my field have of extreme PTSD, as these old arguments that I've seen hashed out for 10 years are being reintroduced and fought over a weekend when everyone is grieving around the potential loss of a critical climate policy initiative from a unique legislative opportunity. And it is striking to watch people talk about the role of carbon pricing, because I am somebody who will tell you that a smart carbon pricing system, a policy that puts a price on the climate pollution that companies put into the atmosphere, that we buy stuff, we drive cars, we use electricity, we cause it. That's a really smart piece of economic policy if you want to address the pollution side of the problem. And it is often very difficult politically, because it imposes a direct cost that is very salient and visible to consumers. It's very salient and visible to the industries that are big users of energy and big polluters. And time again, when these kinds of policies do get enacted, and they actually are not enacted very often, they are very easily captured by the industries whose pollution they're meant to control in the first place. And I tell this story because part of the reason I think we're stuck is that 4 years ago, we were in a crisis with our own cap and trade program, one of the many tools the state of California has used to control its pollution. The impending end of the program was in sight. It was causing turmoil in that program, and there was a political consensus that it needed to be extended. And because of our state constitution, that extension required a 2/3 vote. So a very difficult bill was written called AB 398, which created this committee on which I serve. And just to be clear, I am not representing the committee today. I'm just speaking in my own personal capacity. It extends the program through 2030. It provides the authority to the regulator, the California Air Resources Board, to enact policies to achieve California's landmark 2030 climate target. And it also rolls back the authority that the local air districts, the ones that regulate local air pollution from stationary sources on the South Coast, for example, or in the Bay Area where I live, precludes them from addressing greenhouse gas regulations directly. And it also centralizes all of the activities that would regulate the climate emissions from the state's very prominent oil and gas industry into the cap and trade program with no new policies allowed. Now, this was a very controversial and difficult compromise. I will say, as one of the sort of more visible critics of that compromise, that the bill provided the regulator with sufficient authority to write a program that worked to put us on track for our goals. They did not. And for 5 years now, almost, we have been treading water, pretending that we have a set of climate policies that is in line with the target that the legislature and the previous governor set. It is now binding law to create a 2030 climate target to reduce our climate pollution 40% below where it was in 1990. We got to the 1990 levels a little bit early. We did a great job on that. We have to cut an additional 40% over the next 10 years, and we are taking very little action to do that. There's another important question, which Assemblymember Muratsuchi's bill asks, which is how should we get to net zero emissions by mid-century? And that's an extremely important conversation to have. The reason I introduce the challenges with the cap and trade program, and we can get into any of that if that's of interest, is that there's this perception that we are on track and we've succeeded. And that has sapped attention from the implementation agenda. It has sapped attention from the policies and measures that are needed to get things done. And has made it difficult to encourage progress during a very challenging time. The last sort of big picture item I want to raise in my remarks, and I look forward to being in conversation with all of you all, is the complex working relationship between proponents of climate policy, especially in the environmental movement, and the labor movement. If you go back in history and you look at California's groundbreaking world leadership on clean electricity, a lot of the bills to get that job done reflect a partnership between those two communities. And indeed, we saw that in the bills that Anne referenced at the start of the session. The offshore wind bill, for example, a very important bill. We have incredible offshore wind resources, particularly in the northern part of the state. That was a bill to facilitate and encourage the smart development of those resources that you saw environmentalists and labor interests align on. I should also, with deep respect for the labor movement, differentiate between what I would call the services side of the labor movement, teachers, nurses, other people who have office type jobs or service type jobs, from those in the building trades, those associated with construction, electrical working, pipe fitting, other important aspects of the skilled trades. The building trades have historically been key partners in the environmental movement, at least around clean electricity. When it comes to these broader climate policy conversations around cap and trade or around Mr. Muratsuchi's bill, the building trades unions have been strongly opposed to measures that would directly affect the interests of the oil and gas industry, which continues to be one of the few industries where a person without a college education can expect a high quality career as a pipe fitter working in the refineries or another aspect of those very prominent industries. And that tension and that division, I think, is at the root of a lot of the inability to make progress within the Democratic Party coalition. And the lack of an answer that is acceptable both to the climate policy community and to the building trades labor community, I think has been a great challenge. That challenge has now become front and center in the conversation around carbon neutrality because many of the technologies and strategies that some groups think are necessary to get to carbon neutrality involve carbon capture and storage, either capturing the carbon pollution at refineries and power plants, or perhaps using direct air capture and capturing CO2 from the ambient atmosphere for underground injection. These kinds of technologies have a variety of complications and challenges. One of their main advantages from a political point of view is that they involve the kinds of skilled labor that is traditionally employed in the oil and gas industry. They might be located in many of the parts of the state that are economically depressed and have historically opposed aggressive environmental policy. And it's potentially a path where those two sets of interests could reconcile. The flip side of this conversation is that the rising concerns around environmental injustice, not just with air and water quality, but broadly with social and economic inequality, is running headfirst into this conversation. And just the other week, I was speaking to a group of environmental justice advocates around these same issues. And many of the issues around carbon neutrality that I know were of a particular sensitivity in Mr. Muratsuchi's bill are just completely dead in the water from some of these groups' perspectives, because they perceive these kinds of technologies as a green light to continue business as usual in the oil and gas industry, or at minimum, to create or retain polluting facilities in low-income communities of color. And we have these two broad, massive political disagreements that are right in front of us as we think about trying to extend our targets, which has been extraordinarily difficult. And we have lurking in the background this kind of policy by press release problem that for several years we've just sort of assumed we're on track for things. And I promise you, when you look very closely, the numbers do not lie. We are not anywhere near on track. And the question of how to make a regulator implement something better and how to create the politics and awareness that sustain those possibilities is a very difficult subject. I don't have any simple or clear answers. But I wanted to, in sort of opening up the conversation, introduce the sense of lost time, the scale of the problem, and some of the very difficult kinds of challenges we will see where groups that have traditionally either come together or whose needs for coming together are part of the political problem of solving this issue, where there's some pretty clear and serious disagreements between them, and no clear and easy answers. I'll just say in closing that I think watching Mr. Muratsuchi's bill from a distance, I admire the efforts that he and the coalition behind that bill made to create a forum for those conversations. And I would be very interested to hear his thoughts and others about how to make progress, because it is no simple matter. And I have a deep respect for folks who take a serious crack at that, as the Assembly member has. So, and let me pause there. I don't know if you want to go next to Mr. Muratsuchi or others, but I'm at your disposal.
Let's move on to Al, and then we'll have you both as a panel for our questions. Okay, welcome, Assemblymember Muratsuchi. Were you here when I introduced you?
Yes, I was.
Okay, good.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay.
Thank you, and thank you, Pals First Democrats, for inviting me once again to talk about one of my top priorities, which is fighting climate change. And it's so exciting to be able to join Dr. Cullenward. I learned about all of Dr. Cullenward's great work when I became chair of the Joint Legislative Committee on Climate Change Policies. And, he serves a very important role as the vice chair of the Independent Energy Markets Advisory Committee, basically advising the legislature and the Air Resources Board on some of these, extremely complicated issues related to energy and its interaction with our climate agenda. So I'm also looking forward to engaging in a discussion rather than just my doing a lot of talking. I'm especially interested in Dr. Cullenward's recent discussion with environmental justice groups, because that's been one of the tough nuts to crack in terms of not only AB 1395, but so many other climate action bills that we debate in the legislature. So let me just give a quick adding to what Dr. Cullenward was emphasizing in terms of the massive scale of this crisis that we're facing, as well as the urgent sense of now in terms of the global climate crisis. I mean, I think PV Democrats, we have a pretty highly educated and sophisticated audience, and so I don't want to repeat a lot of what you probably already know, but the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on climate change just a couple of months ago, issued their latest report that just reinforces what we should already know, which is that climate change is being caused by man-made emissions, by human-made emissions, and that It is what the UN Secretary General called it is code red for humanity. Code red for humanity. We cannot delay this crisis anymore. And nations around the world are coming around the consensus that we need to take dramatic action in the next 10 years to ensure that we don't cross that tipping point, the 1.5 degree Celsius increase in global temperatures that may lead to irreversible harm to our planet and to our ability to survive on this planet. So and of course we're seeing it in California, right? I mean, the wildfires, 9 of the worst wildfires in California's history have been in the last 2 years. The extreme heat, the LA Times just had the front page article talking about how, more and more people are dying from the heat. I use the analogy of, we're like the boiling frogs, and we're rather than trying to turn down the heat, we're trying to figure out how to have a more insulated can to sit in. And it's urgent stuff. The drought that is wiping out some communities in the state of California, on and on. I can't emphasize enough, again, as Dr. Cullenward said, how climate change impacts so many aspects of our life, and that we cannot delay in taking dramatic action against it. Unfortunately, we're going to get into this more, but it has been a huge challenge to advance California's climate agenda. I'm sad to say that while California likes to think that we're leading the country in the fight against climate change. We're already falling behind several states like the state of Washington, state of Massachusetts, the state of New York. In terms of continuing our leadership in the fight against climate change. And a perfect example of this is what happened to my bill, Assembly Bill 1395. 3 main components of what 1395 involved. Number one, it is to codify what Governor Brown issued in an executive order for the state of California to reach carbon neutrality, net zero greenhouse gas emissions by or before 2045. So that's the number one goal of the bill. The second goal of the bill was the more controversial, more difficult part of the bill, which is to achieve that carbon neutrality goal by achieving a 90% emission reduction, 90% in reducing the greenhouse gas emission levels measured compared to the 1990 levels by or before 2045. And while that may sound extremely ambitious, I go back to what other states have already done. Washington, Massachusetts, New York, they have adopted emission reduction goals around 95 to 90% by mid-century. And so this is clearly the direction that we need to take in terms of setting the goals and making plans to get to those goals, through the rapid ramping up of renewable energy, as well as making the transition to more electric transportation through cars and trucks and so forth. And the third component of the bill was to set basic regulations, parameters, guidelines, in the use of the carbon capture and storage technologies that Dr. Cullenward mentioned earlier, to make sure, basically, to encourage and to incentivize the innovation in the state of California, which is what we do best. We're the innovation state in so many ways, and we want to be national and global leaders in terms of carbon capture and storage technology, also as a critical part of what we needed to reach carbon neutrality by mid-century. But we want to make sure that it's real, it's verifiable, and that it's transparent. That it's not going to be just a bunch of greenwashing, as you know, unfortunately, we've been reading about again in the LA Times, you know, some of the problems with the cap and trade offsets program, where a lot of times these programs are set up to look nice, but, you know, is it really actually resulting in reductions in carbon emissions? We need to make sure that it's not just a lot of games being played by the fossil fuel industries, to make it seem like they're reducing carbon emissions when in fact they're not. So that was my bill. But the bill, you know, Anne, you said that it was tabled, but it was not tabled. I want to emphasize that the bill was defeated on the Senate floor by a vote of 14 ayes to 12 noes, and everyone else being abstentions. And and that included, I believe it was 12 Democrats who abstained, and 3 or 4 Democrats who voted against the bill. And that goes into the main point of today's discussion. Why is it so difficult for us to advance the climate agenda? I mean, it's for those of us who have been following what's been happening at the Torrance refinery, you know, our efforts to eliminate the use of hydrofluoric acid at the Torrance refinery. It's the same dynamics. It's as Dr. Cullenward mentioned earlier, the state building and construction trades. They are working hand in hand with the Western State Petroleum Association ever since they entered into a project labor agreement, where they basically get all union jobs in terms of the major maintenance turnaround projects for these for all of the major oil companies in the state of California. And so, in terms of anything that is calling for ambitious, aggressive reductions in fossil fuel burning, drilling, emissions, the state building and construction trades unions, take front and center in opposition to these bills. I mean, we saw this with my bill. We saw this earlier the year in terms of bills attempting to ban fracking, bills attempting, my bill last year to try to establish minimum oil drilling setbacks to protect low-income communities of color. I mean, those bills have all been aggressively opposed by the state building and construction trades. Last but not least, we also saw another wrinkle that Dr. Cullenward mentioned, perhaps more than a wrinkle, but a challenge, a real challenge in terms of advancing some of these bills, especially my bill, AB 1395, was the opposition from the other end of the spectrum, from the environmental justice groups. And, to put in another way, their opposition to my bill, as they communicated to me, they just basically said, we don't want carbon capture and storage technologies to be used, as an excuse to continue to burn fossil fuels, and to drill for fossil fuels and refine fossil fuels in their backyards. They just want to keep it in the ground. And, of course, that may be the ideal situation in an ideal world. But if we are to try to do that difficult balancing act of not shutting down our economy while at the same time, working aggressively toward fighting climate change, to do what we need to do to save our planet, that's the balancing act that I was proposing, that we were proposing in AB 1395. But that challenge continues. So let me just stop there and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Al. So let's do a panel with Al and Dr. Cullenward. Okay, so before we get into some of the questions, I did want you to mention, Assembly Member, that you are going to Glasgow.
Yes.
And are you on our U.S. delegation, or what is your role?
Oh, I'm not important enough to be in the U.S. delegation, but I'll be part of the California delegation. There'll be a number of legislators. I'm not sure if Ben Allen is going to be going also. I suspect that he may be, but there'll be a good number of us. And I have to admit, this is going to be my first COP conference, and so I'm very excited. But I've been told by those that have attended, by California legislators that attended before, that California actually gets a lot of props, a lot of respect at these global climate conferences, because basically two things. One is that we are the world's fifth largest economy as measured by gross domestic product, but also, of course, what California has been doing, especially in terms of cap and trade and other leading policies that the state has been able to enact. And so very much looking forward to representing California and engaging and in conversations. Dr. Cullenward, are you going to be going also?
No, I have young kids at home, so I'm not leaving the house much these days. I'll also say, as a longtime climate person, these are interesting meetings. It can be really useful to meet other people and see them, but not a lot happens when it comes to climate policy. We're in a world where people bring their successes to those conferences rather than come up with an idea and get something done at those conferences. So I think it's great and important for leaders like yourself to go and represent. But for somebody like me who's trying to work on the details, it's not really a place to get anything done. It's a place to see and be seen, which is important in its own right. But the real work is here at home.
Okay. Well, I'm hoping also to meet some good people and figure out how we can collaborate. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, so on that, both of you talked a little bit about it. So it had to do. So I said table, and that was not the right word. I know it got voted no, but I thought it could be reintroduced.
Yes. So
that's why I said tabled.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So just to clarify, the bill did not get the necessary 21 majority votes on the Senate floor. We were short 7 votes, but there was a motion for reconsideration granted. So we're going to keep working on. We have through next year to see if we can, work together with all stakeholders, including those that oppose the bill, to see if we can pass something meaningful next year.
Okay, so on that topic, so in terms of how so you both kind of talked to this a little bit in terms of the fossil fuel industry co-opting perhaps the union members to see that the loss of jobs. And the thing is, when you do transition from fossil fuels, someone is losing a job or they're going to transition to another job. So I was on another meeting where they talked about energy veterans. So the way they, you're transitioning from you're a veteran as a fossil fuel person, but now you're going to be in whether you continue in the green energy or some other type of job. And so they proposed a transition policy that you are funding them to transition so that they know they're not losing a job or that they're going to get another job, almost like having a universal salary or something, that you're giving them a certain amount of time to change up, and by having them know that they're not losing a job but gaining into another industry gets them on your side. And I was wondering if in your legislation that you add that in, that where you're showing that these people can't be against you, but that you're helping them. So that's one thing. Then the other on that same thing is where the fossil fuel industry is using things like cap and trade, carbon capture, other things to keep, like what Danny was saying, to keep with what they want to do. In other words, they're not changing, right? So maybe you can both speak to this in terms of how do we legislate to do this transition?
Danny, you want to go first?
Sure, I'd be happy to start. I mean, I think one thing to say on the jobs and you call the transition issues, it's really common in like especially I've run around in like elite policy circles. People talk about just transition. That's the word that gets thrown out. You'll never hear a single person in Kern County use that word and be happy about it. Transition is not a happy word for the communities whose interests are affected by the actual transition that climate policy advocates want to see. And I just raised that because it is such an extraordinarily sensitive topic. And what matters is less what, foundation funded academics and think tanks say about that, and more what the representatives of those labor communities believe is real and legitimate. And this is in no way a comment on Mr. Muratsuchi's bill or his efforts, more that I think one of the big challenges we have is that as the climate policy community has tended to concentrate in urban and coastal areas, there's less cultural overlap, the actual communities who are affected, and there's a greater cultural difference that needs to be bridged and needs to be perceived as legitimate by a very different group of people than is typically asking questions around where should climate policy go. So again, no criticisms intended so much as when we talk about a transition, that word itself is not a word that the person you're trying to convince will ever use. And that's indicative of the kind of sort of political and cultural problem we need to manage. I think to add some color, I think Mr. Muratsuchi expressed it really nicely about how his bill got pushback from sort of both sides, say the oil industry and allied labor groups saying it's going too far, and environmental justice groups saying it's not going far enough. As a similar kind of problem, if you're an environmental justice group, you are thinking a lot about how the refineries in particular have basically stood up this carbon offsets program that dominates the way our cap and trade program compliance works. So on paper, we're supposed to be reducing our emissions. And in practice, the refineries are buying credits from forests where people said, I was going to cut it down, but I didn't. And it's all kind of shaky. And I shared a link earlier in chat about this big LA Times story that the Assembly member referenced. The reason I mention all this again is if you are somebody who works closely with an environmental justice group who lives in Wilmington or up in the Bay Area here in like Martinez or Benicia next to one of these refineries, Mr. Muratsuchi's bill and most of the conversations around carbon neutrality are talking about giving a whole bunch of authority to the regulator that's been screwing you over. So even though we could come up with, write down some standards where a bunch of technical people would say, these are really good standards on paper, there's a lack of trust there about who's in charge. And that same kind of trust dynamic and gap, which I think is in no way a reflection of Mr. Muratsuchi's efforts, is present on the labor side as well, and reflects a much deeper divide between labor and the environmental community, which again, the couple of glimmers of sunlight on that. One, there's a change in leadership in the building trades. So there's new people who are going to be at the negotiating table. And we also saw a really successful partnership on the offshore wind bill, where the labor forces were aligned very closely with the climate interests in a very different context. So I don't know if Mr. Muratsuchi has thoughts, but I think those are two very, very important issues. And again, the thing I always ask is, how does the constituency you're trying to convince of something, how do they perceive the way you're asking the question and the issues that are coming to the table? And climate has the unfortunate curse of having to ask that of basically every constituency.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Dr. Cullenward is talking about the different cultures, maybe between the coastal communities and, like, say, Kern County, where most of the oil drilling takes place in our state. But on the issue of the distrust of the Air Resources Board, the regulator, the regulating agency that the state calls upon to lead our efforts against climate change, at least as it relates to the emissions. I just want to share that there were many legislators as well as environmental organizations who have historically expressed skepticism or criticism of the Air Resources Board, who suddenly, when when I was lobbying them for my bill, AB 1395, they were suddenly saying, well, why not just leave it to the Air Resources Board to do it? And so, I mean, I suspect that was more, especially with the legislators, to give them a convenient out rather than, a newfound faith in the Air Resources Board. On the issue of, whether we call it a just transition or anything else, I do want to, highlight that I'm having very hopeful discussions. There's a coalition of labor organizations. I'm not sure if Dr. Cullenward is aware, and if he has more information, I'd love to hear about it. But there is a group of labor unions that have coalesced and endorsed this Pollen report from a professor from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, who and these are some major unions, many of them the public employee unions. We'll often see, as Dr. Cullenward mentioned earlier, there's a qualitative, well, I don't know if a qualitative difference, but there are different constituencies in terms of the public employee unions versus the state building and construction trades. This report has been endorsed by powerful labor unions like SEIU, AFSCME, the Communication Workers of America, as well as the United Steelworkers. And there's some interesting history between the state building and construction trades of the United Steelworkers. But even when we in our own efforts in our backyard with the Torrance refinery, we saw that the United Steelworkers have been more willing to. They are expressing more of an interest to engage in this discussion about a transition to away from fossil fuels. How are they going to be taken care of? I mean, as Dave Campbell from the United Steelworkers, local in our area, has said, they see the writing on the wall. They see that the movement of the country and the world is going toward renewable energy, and so the big question is, rather than sticking their heads in the sand, how are they going to be part of the solution, as well as how are they going to be taken care of? And so I'm engaged in potential legislation for next year in terms of how we can try to implement some of the recommendations of this Pollen report that the labor unions have endorsed. But again, keeping in mind that while there are some powerful labor unions that have endorsed the concept of the report, they do not involve the state building and construction trades.
Did you want to comment on that, Dr. Cullenward, and I guess you did have a recent talk with the environmental justice groups. That's what.
Yeah, and again, it's sort of what I indicated. If you, and I don't speak for an environmental justice group, so I just want to be very clear. I'm passing along my sentiment and the longstanding respect I have for folks in that world. I think if you are skeptical of how the regulator has been behaving, and you feel the regulator has used complex programs to defer action in your community, you tend to not trust approaches that empower that regulator. And I also want to reflect what I heard Mr. Muratsuchi said. I think the most admirable piece of his bill was this requirement that upset everybody, unfortunately, even though it was absolutely great policy, which is a requirement when we talk about net zero. Very easy in a net zero conversation for people to imagine wild fantasies about trees and soils and magical machines sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So we don't have to take any action because something else is going to solve the problem later. That is one of the biggest dangers about the moment we're in, is how easy it is to indulge either in the sense of like loving trees, loving farms, loving machines, whatever it is, as an excuse to not take action early. And it's a really very personal and psychological response folks have to that. And Mr. Muratsuchi's bill said you got to get 90% of the way there by reducing your emissions. And there's a whole bunch of technical and political fights about what carbon removal should look like for that last 10%. The key thing is it should be small, something like 10%. But the regulator didn't like that. They wanted to be able to set their own numbers. If you are persuasive, if you're closely aligned with the regulator, as many of the incumbent industries are, you don't like that because that number is going to tell you to go farther than you would have to if you got to have a shot at that in an opaque regulatory lobbying process. And at the same time, the constituencies who I would like to make the case to groups like environmental justice groups, look, I'm not saying we're just going to screw you over on the last 10%, but could we park these anxieties and insecurities in a box called it's a very small part of the problem and get on board with moving forward? Unfortunately, I think because the entire construct is about empowering the regulator, and that didn't seem, I think, to many people like as much of a protection as it is when I look at it. So I look at that and I say, wow, that gets you a lot of what you want. It allows us to put a box around this conversation and to keep it going. But again, it's just like, as I said, with a just transition, it's got to be persuasive to the person that you're trying to convince. And I think because of this legacy of distrust with environmental justice communities and the regulator, it is hard to make that case in that way, which is, again, it's not like I have a better idea. And in fact, I think it was about as good as it could be. But that is when, when I have the same kind of conversation with EJ groups, the pushback I get is, you trust they're going to go do the right thing? And I can't say that I do. At the same time, I don't think that's a really good reason to walk away from a discussion.
Thank you for that clarification. Okay, I see Tony Hales has his hand up and he's very good at framing the conversation.
That's very kind of you. I do want to ask the panel, but I also want to direct some of this conversation about the unions and about this issue, and that is that we need to organize in the union. And if we don't reach out to union members and organize within the union to create new leadership, it's going to take a long time for them to come around to just carrots that we're offering them. So unfortunately, this is a huge issue and there are no shortcuts. So it all comes down to, we need to organize within the environmental community. I'm former chair of the Environmental Caucus, and I know how divided our community is. There's a lot of frustration that they want everything now. And if it's not 100%, then they won't get behind it because they're frustrated. And I understand that, but we have to make progress on what's achievable step by step. And so organizing the environmental community and organizing within the unions, I think, is what we must do. And I would be glad to hear from the assembly member and the doctor their thoughts on that approach.
Well, I guess I can start. I mean, yeah, how do you achieve a culture change, not only in terms of the leadership, but in terms of the membership? I mean, I mean, the fact that the United Steelworkers, at least their leadership, are taking steps to support, some kind of a transition to renewable energy, gives me hope. But I mean, focusing on what I know a little bit more about, which is the leadership in the legislature. There was a lot of heat put on the Senate leadership for letting so many of these most significant climate action bills die in the Senate. And I can tell you that both with my oil drilling setback bill last year and with this AB 1395 carbon neutrality bill this year, it would not have gotten out of the state assembly without the strong backing of the assembly speaker, Anthony Rendon. I mean, he was twisting arms to get the votes to get the bill out of the assembly, and there was a great group of senators, including Ben Allen, who they formed a delegation and they met with the Senate President Pro Tem Tony Atkins, I mean, for my humble opinion, we still need to see stronger leadership from the Senate leadership, especially a leadership to show a willingness to push back against the state building and construction trades. I mean, just to keep in mind, I mean, I'm a strong union supporter. I'm usually have a 90% plus voting record on to support labor and working men and women. And so many Democrats rely on the campaign donations and the support from especially the state building and construction trades unions. That is why it becomes so difficult to go against them. It's a real bottom line political calculus for many of the legislators. Is voting for this bill worth the political capital that I'm going to expend by crossing the state building and construction trades? And I think that is not only for each individual legislator, but also for the leadership in the legislature.
I'll add, I should mention I serve at the pleasure of the Senate in my role on the advisory committee, so I'm probably not the best person to comment on these issues other than to say, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I've seen in several years of legislative advising a lack of sort of cooperation between the two houses, including where I see members and leadership positions really well aligned. And I think the more that can be done to further those connections, that's going to be very, very important. And also, just to add, I mean, my parents came from union families. My partner had dental care because of unions. I'm not here to say that the building trades are the problem. The problem is that the building trades are powerful and they oppose this. And the answer is we've got to figure out a way to confront that situation and figure out a path forward. And to Tony, to your original question, I mean, the problem with all of this is that a lot of the climate activism, which I want to deeply respect and embrace, is calling for urgent radical action now. And it is very difficult to channel that into the kinds of pragmatic opportunities that exist in the face of really highly organized opportunities. And that's the magic of all of it. And I agree, it takes a direction ultimately from leadership. Which is part of why my original concern is there's this perception California figured all this stuff out, and we mostly kick the can down the road. And I think the sooner we recognize where we are, the easier it's going to be to have the next step in the conversation, whatever that exactly needs to be. I don't know for sure, but I think it starts with saying, okay, how can we make sure that the jobs work? How can we make sure that people who are traditionally aligned with the building trades feel comfortable, and that organizing to change how members of that community, of that union community, think about these options and opportunities. That's a great idea. But it starts with where we are, not where we thought we were.
Okay, Doug Bender, your question.
Hi, first, and great panel. Congratulations on pulling this off. This is so much fun watching this. So we talked about just transition. There's another transition that is really hitting the headlines right now. Both China and Europe, they're having power outages in China for various reasons. In Europe, they shut down the nuclear plants, which I agree with. I mean, nuclear plants are inherently dangerous, and what do you do with the waste? But it's resulted in them having to ramp up coal production. In China, they have a pricing disparity between coal and power, and so the coal mines are getting shut down, and they can't even keep the factories going. So this whole thing, it needs to be planned. There needs to be transition over to cleaner energy with the right incentives in place to make the thing work. And it's not just about solar panels on roofs and solar farms and wind farms. It's about energy storage, and we talk about using natural gas as a bridge fuel or as a replacement for storage. So I guess my question is for the Assembly member, Al, as you are talking, you said you've made some headway with the unions because they see that there's jobs for them, and there's a dying industry, the fossil fuel industry. The energy storage industry is as important as the energy production industry. As we go into these sources where you can only get solar power during the day and so on. electric cars are going to be a large part of energy storage, actually. That's where a lot of the batteries are going to be. So can you give us some thoughts about how we do the transition over to cleaner energy?
Yeah, Doug, I appreciate your focus, especially on the importance of energy storage. I can give you a good example that, it always comes back to, for me, I always say there's the policy and there's the politics. And a lot of times the policy may make like absolute sense, but then people haven't figured out how to make the politics work. And a good example of that is energy storage. The IBEWs, the union electrical workers that work, especially for the utilities, they've been strongly in support of the utilities ramping up, these large scale energy storage projects, and while we need to continue to do more, we've been making some progress in that respect. But on the other hand, if you saw I know some people on this call were closely, participating in the debate over the elimination of the credits for the rooftop solar. Those jobs that are represented by the rooftop solar combined with the energy storage for like individual homes to form your little microgrid. I mean, those are not union jobs, and so that's why the legislators that are closely aligned with the labor unions, took the leadership in fighting against those subsidies for rooftop solar, and that's in contrast to when the union workers see the energy storage as being in their interest, like with the union utility workers, they will be more willing to support those.
Okay, did you want to comment? Okay.
That's great.
Okay. There is a comment here in the chat from Denzi about he thought IBEW members did comment against the AB 1139 about net metering.
Yeah, so they opposed it because we're talking about non-union residential rooftop solar and storage.
Okay.
Just to clarify, Ann, and Al knows because we talked about this a lot, with the half hour at the Utilities and Energy Commission hearing, which Al was a part of, overwhelming number of calls in that half hour coming from environmental groups opposing 1139 and from small solar companies. What was gratifying was individual IBEW members who were saying that they knew there were jobs that could be had from rooftop solar. The only one speaking in favor of 1139 was the leadership of these trade unions, for exactly the reasons that Assemblyman Muratsuchi said. This dangerous alliance with these big utility projects, frankly, environmentally dangerous because they're big projects out in the desert and other places, instead of exploiting the full potential of rooftop solar. So that's just a clarification. It was gratifying for me to hear individual IBEW members saying, no, there are jobs with rooftop, and it was leadership, as many people have been saying in the comments here. Thank you.
Thank you, Denzi. Before I get to the hand, I did have an older chat question on chat that I forgot about. This was when you were speaking, Dr. Cullenward. This had to do with, is carbon tax preferable to cap and trade? So you had talked about both, but maybe you could just elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think it's unequivocally better in the sense that you could see what it is, you could see what it's doing. It's harder to play games. And those are also the reasons why it's been politically more challenging to enact almost everywhere. It's very easy to say you have a cap and trade program. To one of Mr. Muratsuchi's comments about, one of the ways legislators respond to policy ideas is if it's the regulator's problem to figure out, it's an easier vote to take. And that dynamic is played out a lot in this broader area of carbon pricing. You can have a cap and trade program, which would take me an hour to explain to you. but you say, hey, let's go get our target. We're guaranteed we're going to get there, and there'll be a whole bunch of rules to figure that out. That's a relatively easy vote compared to here's the price we're going to put on pollution, which means somebody can run an attack ad against that legislator for the price impacts they're going to put on gasoline. It's real clear. And for those exact same reasons, it tends to be more effective when you can get it done. The other thing I saw in chat was this question about, there's a lot of interest from grassroots groups around this idea of a carbon dividend or giving the money back to people. Most of the revenues in California's program are spent in what's called their greenhouse gas reduction fund on to be totally honest, a variety of things. Nominally, it's supposed to be climate related measures. It's mostly not. But there's a lot of good things that get funded, even good non-climate things. And the idea with a dividend is the opposite, is to say, let's give every could be resident a cut of the revenue. And that tends to protect the lowest income households very, very well, and can even protect sort of the middle class folks as well. It tends to result in only the very wealthiest paying a sort of net charge. I think that's a really good public policy, personally. I helped write a bill to do that in 2017. And one of the big problems with it is when you look at the interest groups that are involved, it's the people who get revenue who are the most organized. So the existing recipients, people who support the programs that are currently funded, generally not in favor of you taking that revenue away. And I will be the first person to say that's a really good public policy. But the fact that you might get a check, every couple of months and that makes you whole, doesn't get most people out of bed, doesn't get them riled up, doesn't get them to call and to lobby and to do all the things that's necessary to sustain that. So I'll just throw that out there. I think those are two interesting directions. And as California thinks about maybe actually having a more successful carbon pricing program, maybe we want to couple that to making sure that low-income households get their cut back. But it's been very, very difficult to enact carbon taxes and these so-called fee and dividend policies for those political reasons.
That's interesting. I'm kicking around ideas for a just transition bill for next year, and I was thinking about just for a sake of discussion, an oil extraction tax where the funds would go towards supporting a lot of the worker transition programs that are highlighted in this Pollen report on an equitable transition. Supporting pensions of retiring fossil fuel workers, job retraining, education. But maybe it could be a combination not only of funding a equitable transition fund, but also a dividend, especially for low-income communities, to try to soften the impact on low-income communities.
Tony Hale, you have your hand up.
Yeah, my hand's up again. So the executive board of the California Democratic Party is going to meet later this month on the 24th to consider an issue about whether the party should abstain from money from natural gas, the natural gas industry, and also from police organizations. They're two very separate issues. But just on the issue of natural gas, the party has traditionally given up oil money, direct oil money, but they have taken money from natural gas. Now, this is an evolving process. For over a year now, the party has abstained from natural gas money as well. But I would like to ask our two guests, what do you think is the role of natural gas industry money in our political process? And do you see any direct correlation towards environmental policies? I would just like to get an assessment from the two of you on that issue.
Mr. Muratsuchi, do you want to start? I'm happy to if you prefer.
Why don't you go ahead?
Again, please hear me. I'm mostly the technical nerd who hangs around political folks, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. It's not necessarily my expertise. We haven't talked very much about one critical area of the climate and clean energy movement, which is building electrification. I think there's basically no ambiguity. We need to electrify basically all of the services in homes and office buildings, schools, all the rest of it. That's the long-term trajectory we need to go on. And that is running just headfirst into a confrontation with the gas industry, which includes elements of this just transition conversation, right? If you are a gas utility worker, you face the same kinds of issues that somebody who's doing oil and gas production faces. So I want to make sure that that's part of the conversation. But I think in this building electrification process, there is this direct and very immediate conflict between the gas industry and the gas utilities, including sometimes the production side, but often the utility side, where there is a very direct and pointed contrast that I don't think there's any question that conflict is slowing down the pace of policy relative to one in which that money isn't present. That's just an observation about that policy area. You know, my limited sense is in these macro, like cap and trade style debates, it is much more about groups like the Western States Petroleum Association than it is about something gas industry specific. But at least with respect to building electrification, which is actually a surprisingly big part of the puzzle, there is a direct and immediate conflict specifically with the gas industry.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wasn't thinking, you know, enough about the building electrification needs. For me, my favorite example is our fight, you know, in Redondo Beach to shut down the AES natural gas power plant. You know, I know that you know, the natural gas power plants were supposed to be phased out. You know, that was decided 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago now, and yet the Energy Commission and the PUC keeps extending the life of these natural gas power plants, and precisely because as we're starting to hear more of the commercials now, you know, what do we do with electricity from 4 to 9 o'clock? You know, when the sun starts setting and the wind starts dying down. I mean, how do we make sure that everyone can keep their lights on when we flip the switch? I mean, there was just a lot of. I'm trying to figure out how do we that not only for the sake of shutting down these natural gas power plants, but you know, for our climate goals, but also for you know, marine environment. You know, I want to do everything possible to shut those down as quickly as possible. But again, you know, I remember when I sat down with Robbie Hunter, the head of the state building and construction trades unions. You know, he brought up. You know, I was surprised he even knew about my efforts to try to shut down the Redondo Beach power plant, but he brought that up with me. It's like, you know, it's the same thing. It's union jobs at these natural gas power plants also, and so it's very similar political dynamics. Yeah, so I think Dr. Cullenward is right. You know, I don't think the, you know, Southern California Gas Company or Sempra. You know, they're significant lobbies in Sacramento, but they're not at the same level of the Western State Petroleum Association.
And just to add, I mean, you brought this up, but you know, it's not like we want to get rid of gas immediately. Like, we don't have a system that can operate without gas. This is about building the infrastructure that's required to get to that point, as well as accelerating those retirements for the reasons the Assembly member referenced. But you know, I think that's one of the things that makes this so tough is if your job is to keep the lights on, you don't say, I want to shut down every plant first. They're sort of coordinated and conditioned on a long-term build out, which is why it's so difficult and fraught to come up with simple answers in these situations, which again is consistent with everything I heard the Assembly members say. Just something to flag, like, even if you are somebody like myself who thinks geothermal or storage is going to come in and answer the question that gas answers right now, that's not going to answer it today. It's not going to answer it next year, maybe in 5 or 10 years. But that's the kind of sort of time frame of realistic transitions in these capital intensive sectors, and probably a little longer.
So that gets to the point where these utilities are still wanting to keep power. I mean, keep their own political power. And so every time when I see a change, even through the what is it, the South Bay City Council of Governments, I always see advertisements from gas and electrical in their correspondence, because so even when you're trying to do a change, they're still advocating for their own infrastructure. So that gets to something that I had talked to Dr. Cullenward before he got on, having to do with hydrogen, green hydrogen versus blue and gray hydrogen. I mean, hydrogen can be used for the polluting production of cement and concrete, but it has to be green hydrogen, and they're not promoting green hydrogen. So I think it's a sausage making process, but you have to push back against them. And just getting to what Tony Hale had said, I'd say you don't want to take money from them. So if you have a vote, that would be my preference. So we do have a hand up. I don't see your name. I can't remember, but parents of murdered children, murdered something.
Yeah, I forgot to change the thing. My name is
Yeah.
Kathy. I forgot to change it. I speak under different ones on these Zoom. But anyway, yeah, as one of the members of this club that happens to be a union member, who is constantly being pushed upon to work in the terminals that are one of the biggest polluting things in our area are the ports, right? Well, many years ago, we advocated for shore power for these ships so that they wouldn't be idling, and we helped clean up tremendously with that. But I think what happens in our union and people with us, like I will talk about the building and trades in a minute, is they think that, we're not concerned about these things, but we are. We are the ones standing next to the ships. We are the ones standing next to these cranes and these UTRs that are spewing this stuff. And living in the ports of LA, Long Beach, we are next to the two refineries that, are using this MHF stuff. But, the problem is our terminals all being owned by other countries, they don't care how they make their money, and they're going to eliminate. We know that they're up against the requirement to, go green and stop the pollution, but the problem is they want to automate without keeping bodies in the machines, and it's not necessary. Every single machine out there, because we talked about just transition, every single machine out there can be cleaned up but still driven by a person, therefore protecting our economy and our jobs, right? So, but they choose not to. They choose to pick the machines that are not drivable, and we've lost hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of jobs at the Merce facility and the TrayPac and the Long Beach container terminal. We know they're up against it, and believe if anybody cares, it's us. We're right up against that equipment, and our children go to school in the area for those that still live there, and we live next to the refineries. But I wanted to say that the ILWSCDC, which I was president of for many years, we took a position against fracking. We took a position in favor of the setbacks in our cities, because Wilmington and San Pedro, they have our families that live there are affected by those things. And the MHF, when we took a position on the MHF against it, trying to get them to change it, absolutely on all three of those issues, we got calls from the buildings and trades calling us and saying, what are you doing? Even though they're good for the economy, good for the workers, good for environment, the pushback is definitely on their side. It isn't on ours. We did support these things or oppose these things, and we're faced with losing hundreds and hundreds of jobs too. And, we don't have a problem partnering with the environmentalists, because we need you to help us keep our ports open and keep us working, because it can be done. And if the community jumps in and helps us with this, we can stop any more automation. If you help us, and then we in turn can help you with those kind of things too, because it affects every single one of us. We all live and work here. So I just wanted to add that it's a big issue for us too. In so many ways, it affects us, And Al knows that. Yes. It's Kathy Familetti, Al.
Yeah, that's right. No, thank you, Kathy. I mean, I know that the ILWU has been a progressive. I mean, I like to say a progressive, even to the point where it's sometimes I wonder if it's going against some of your individual members' interests. I mean, you have a good healthcare plan, and yet when you came out in support of Bernie's calls for single payer healthcare, I was impressed with that, and so I think ILWU is always standing up to do the right thing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Tony.
Yeah, just one more thing. I do want to recognize Kathy Familotti as our 66th Assembly District Democrat of the Year for this year. She'll be joining with Paul Sayo and receiving our local award. And I think she makes the example of one of the ways that we can reach out to unions. Here's a union that wants to hold on to jobs, and it can make a green transition and partner. And we can partner with them to guarantee that humans still stay involved with the work at the port. So there are points where we can work together, and we can work with union members, member by member, just the way the unions did it. This isn't an anti-union idea. This is doing exactly what the union did, working, organizing with people one-on-one. And then the other aspect that was brought up later, I'll just throw in there, is that we do need to organize to support candidates like Muratsuchi and other environmentally sound candidates, and show them that they have support independent from the union if the union is opposing them. We had a city council race in Los Angeles where the union sent 5 mailers against Lundquist, the candidate running for city council, because she supported the Green New Deal. If we need to make up for that support. And so it all comes down to the hard work of organizing at every level and supporting our efforts at every level. We need to continue to work for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. So why don't we, I think I've been following chat, but I think we've answered most of the questions there. And I think we're at a time where we can summarize where we're going, and it would be nice to know, in your opinion, what's your next, you were talking a little bit about some new legislation you're going to do this next session, but even how you think we can help you get to do these major steps. So we'll start with you, Assembly Member.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you again for this is a great discussion, and I always can count on the Palos Verdes Democrats for having great discussions. I really appreciate you organizing this. There are smart people like Dr. Cullenward, who can figure out that the policy solutions, but we need to figure out, the politics, how to get these good policy ideas enacted into law. And I think that is the critical importance of all of the Democratic Party activists on this call. You have tremendous power, when it comes down to party endorsements. And I would ask you to hold those Democrats that didn't support AB 1395 accountable. Hold those Democrats who didn't support a ban on fracking accountable, because they've made their political calculation, and they think that the keeping the state building and construction trades happy is more important than keeping all of you with the Democratic Party, so I think going back to Tony's point about how important it is to organize to enhance your leverage to support the climate agenda. I think focusing on your party activism to hold Democrats accountable to support the climate agenda is critically important.
I'll just add, I think the complexity of what's required to get things done is big. And I'll echo exactly what Mr. Muratsuchi said. It's not that there aren't, people are thinking about the policy side of this, the politics that are the barrier. At the same time, the politics need to be informed by people who have an open and skeptical mind. Dealing with the climate crisis is going to be more than supporting renewables. Exactly what else it's going to be is a huge and complex question. We need to both harness the momentum that comes from, renewables and EVs and all the good things we know we have to do, without letting that become a tribal barrier to conversations about other directions we need to take the policy. Again, not trying to tell you what those should be, just that those conversations are coming. And to me, that is one of the when I spend a lot of time in climate policy conversations trying to figure out how to put the politics together, the potential to wedge the sort of moderate and particularly grassroots left edges of the spectrum by having divisive ideological tests around what is or is not good climate policy, very easy for opponents of progress to invoke those and to wedge these coalitions. So I just encourage people who care to keep an open and skeptical mind about how to resolve those controversies. And often we are fighting about the last 10% rather than the first 50%. Always get the first 50% done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. And I think for Assemblymember Muratsuchi, he's going to Glasgow, and people think California is the reigning ahead in this climate change process, but we're not. And we're falling back. And like Dr. Cullenward was saying, you were saying 5 years we're behind in terms of what we established 5 years ago. So we haven't made any steps. So I think you both made excellent points today. I'm so glad we're seeing the sausage, how it's made, and it's real easy. I know I find, how can they do that? How can they do that? But it's good to hear what you guys are going through and how we can support that. Thank you for being with us today.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ann.
Okay.
Really
All right.
appreciate it, everyone.
Oh, it was our pleasure to have both of you here. It's great.
All right.
Okay.
Take care.
Take care.